Severance is back with episode 5 of season 2, and we're now officially halfway through the second season. I know, it's flown by, right? This was a dark episode of the show that felt like there was just this constant tension that was present amongst every character following the ORTBO that occurred in episode 4. Whether that be the overwhelming sense of grief and upset that was present due to Irving being gone, the questions around the value of the life of an Innie and if being switched off is the same as actually being killed, the haunting horror movie style opening where we got our first glimpse into the exports hallway, Mr. Milchick's first performance review, Miss Huang's bite back that she was giving Milchik, and the upset that Mark was feeling at the end. We may not have actually attended a traditional funeral, but my god, by the end of the episode I felt like I needed a moment to myself because this was a depressing episode for sure. So as we cross the halfway point, I feel like things are about to get even more complicated. Yeah, not clearer. So let's dive into the episode and discuss all things Severance Season 2 Episode 5. Just to let you know, this video will contain spoilers. Exploring the Innie versus the Outie complex. Something that got a heavy focus in this episode, which I felt was long on the horizon, was the complex that's been created around the value of an Innie, and if their life is as valuable as that of an Outie, plus how it compares. For example, with Helly returning to the severed floor for the first time since Season 1 Episode 9, we saw that she felt disgusted at the fact that Helena hijacked her identity, stole her body, and said that she didn't have the right to take what was hers. Despite the fact that the body is kind of Helena Egan's. Plus, as well as that, we also saw Dylan refer to Irving as being dead, when in reality his physical form still existed, but his Innie's mind was no more. The line that stuck out to me most was when Helly said, "stealing my body." Within my mind, an Innie is something that I've always kind of viewed as secondary. As in, if I had an Innie, it would be my body that would be going into the office, but then a different part of my mind would be taking over. So I suppose, if anything, it's more of a shared body, right? Whereas what Helly said shows total control and the individualistic ownership that she feels she has over Helly and the body that she's within, despite the fact that Helena could stop her from existing if she really wanted to, as we saw with the Glasgow block, meaning that surely she's just a guest inside of that body. It's a difficult complex because it's the same body, same organs, but a different part of the mind that gets tapped into once an individual is severed. It's interesting because an Innie's personality, their memories, and the way that they experience emotions is pretty much the same as to what it would be like if they operated as their own entity. And as we've seen with the Glasgow block and the way that the rest of MDR responded to Helena being there, it was difficult to determine the difference. Something that was reinforced by Mark when he saw her in the bathroom and he said that he felt like he didn't truly know who she was. Now, I would argue that MDR's team existence holds value. They have personalities that differ from their Outies, they have emotions that they can experience individually, and also memories that they hold onto that don't cross over to the outside unless somebody's reintegrated. So they should be seen as sentient individual beings that are people in their own right. I say people because during this episode, when Miss Huang was staring at the mournful signage, she said to Milchik that he shouldn't let them have a funeral. It makes them feel like people. Now, I feel like this reinforced Lumen's overarching view of Innies and that they don't hold the same value as what a person does on the outside, despite the emotions, feelings, and connections that they all have. Even Helena referred to them as effing animals. The fact that they can be permanently dismissed as Irving was, and what I'm going to imagine is taken down to the exports room. It shows that the overarching viewpoint of the value of the life of an Innie is seen as worthless and disposable, despite them experiencing very human emotions. This is a complex that I think is only going to get developed even more in the show, especially with the introduction of the Glasgow block, which Milchik didn't get the chance to explain, Mark being reintegrated and him experiencing both sides of the memories and feelings. The opening scene. Well, the mysterious person that Felicia spoke about when she saw Irving in episode 3 that she said is the only person that now deals with exports has finally been shown to us. Well, not his full face, but with the items that were taken out of the drawer, it looks like whatever goes on in there could be pretty horrific. It looked like dentistry gear, which surprised me. Hearing this mysterious man whistling the song, The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald by Gordon Lightfoot, which is about the wreckage of the ship that sank in 1975, where 29 sailors lost their lives, it's a haunting backdrop to the already unsettling scene that was present. Whether that be because of the tools that he had, the lack of an identity that we could see on his face, or the dark hallway that seemed so familiar to us now, even though it was the first time we were there. I feel like by showing us this painting and drawing of the hallway to exports over the course of the season, and at the end of the previous season, it made it even more frightening walking down that hallway. It's like we'd been down it before in a nightmare because of the amount that we'd seen it, and that familiarity yet also unknown nature of it provided a contrasting feeling in my head that I just couldn't quite come to terms with. We don't know when this scene took place, as it was operating in its own right before the title sequence started playing. So I wonder if it had something to do with Irving. He was permanently dismissed, which essentially means sent away. Something which could be connected to exports. We haven't really seen examples of people being unsevered, but I wonder if exports and the tools that the Doctor had could tie into pretty much exporting the mind of the severed personality. It's still very vague, but I couldn't see Lumen wanting a former employee holding on to all of the data that they've experienced whilst working inside of Lumen, even if it is just sitting there dormant. That's if they can extract that data anyway. I know, it's another theory on top of a pile of theories, but it's just a potential one for now. But I'd say seeing that hallway in person now definitely made me want to know what's at the other end of the elevator. Mr. Milchick's punishment. Before I get onto Milchick's punishment, a punishment that I want to touch on first was the repercussions that Helena faced following her revealing her cover whilst on the ORTBO. The tables had turned dramatically from episode 2, where she was the one dishing out consequences to Harmony Cabell. She was on the same side of the table as what Miss Cabell was previously on, and she was now having to accept a decision that she didn't truly agree with in needing to go back onto the severed floor as Helly are. This was due to Mark being close to completing Cold Harbor, and by the end of the episode getting up to 85%, and it being said that he refused to work unless Helly was there. We still don't truly know the ins and outs of Cold Harbor and what the project contains, but Mr. Drummond said that once it's completed, it will be one of the greatest achievements of the planet. So I wonder if it could connect to that eternal life/resurrection, or the cloning side of things that many of us have been leaning towards with our theories, as surely that would be one of the greatest achievements ever. With regards to Mr. Milchik, we saw that he was also facing trouble following what happened at the ORTBO, and it just so happened to time with his 1-month performance review. Before entering the meeting, he mentioned to Natalie about the paintings that he got, and that if they were a measure of appreciation, then he accepted them gracefully. But it was clear to see that within, he was deeply uncomfortable with them. So much so that he mentioned to Natalie about how she felt about receiving them and the challenges that they both faced. However, Natalie chose not to respond to him, despite saying 1,000 words with her facial expressions. Sidney Cole Alexander acts so well by doing barely anything. Shakespeare did say that the eyes were the window to the soul, and I feel we see that with Natalie. I think she feels the same as Mr. Milchik, but she's afraid of speaking up because she knows that Lumen is always listening. If anything, it kinda showed just how trapped the likes of Milchik and Natalie are, despite not being severed like the members of MDR. Milchik faced a few complaints in his performance review, but one of the main issues that was at hand was the fact that the kindness approach that Milchik was taking towards MDR wasn't diminishing the curiosity that MDR had. So his outcome was to tighten his leash on Mark, Helly and Dylan and treat them in a slightly different way, more like his predecessor, Harmony Cabell, somebody that he made a point of claiming that he wasn't like. The scene where Milchik and Mark were in the elevator, it was a moment which showed that from now on, Mr. Milchik wasn't going to have any mercy on the employees, and he's going to treat them in a much more fierce way. The methods that he was previously trying wasn't working, and the softer, more docile approach was being viewed as a weakness and a way of being able to take advantage of him. So I think we could see a different side to Milchik moving forward. What's going on with Miss Huang? During this episode, there were a couple of strange moments with Miss Huang, a character that we already know is a tad strange. The first was when Helly entered the severed floor. She was sitting there smiling at her in front of the painting that we know as Keir pardons his betrayers, a piece of art that looks the complete opposite to what it's called and is symbolic of the 4 individuals in MDR. Miss Huang's welcoming smile in front of a painting that pretty much looks like it's the beginning of the execution of Helly and her colleagues was a haunting setting that was established from the off. The second strange thing that occurred was when she was getting the funeral set up. She was locked onto the mourningful signage as it was printing, and she advised Mr. Milchik to not let them have a funeral because it would make them feel like people. A moment which felt like she was speaking from experience. I think this could be taken in a couple of different ways. The first is that she's severed and she's gone through that herself and it made her feel like a person. Or she conducted one before and she saw the repercussions of what it can do to an Innie. This ties back to the point that I mentioned at the start. Maybe she feels like in allowing Innies to do things that Outies would do, such as allowing them to grieve and have some kind of ceremony. It will allow them to feel as though they have more of a grasp over their identity and not just be this worker that they were designed to be. I know there was a theory about her potentially being a clone of some kind, and what if that is the case? What if she was a test subject for Cold Harbor and she has a sense of empathy towards them because she knows that she's not 100% human or a person in her eyes? And maybe she's had to experience a funeral before and be faced with the fact that she isn't what she once was. Then I'd say the final strange moment was a power dynamic play that Mr. Milchik did. This was when he made her practice her musical piece for the funeral, and then he denied her the opportunity of playing it in front of the employees. We've only seen the power play like that once before when Milchik looked over at her in episode 1 of the show. He definitely viewed her as inferior in some way, and I really want to know why. Miss Huang continues to be one of the characters that provides the most mystery, and I feel like we're gradually learning more about her. I'm just hoping it'll be worth it. Irving and Burt. We've seen the Outie version of Irving going to the phone booth in the past, and in this episode it was no different. In fact, he said to the person on the other end that Lumen must have realized what his Innie was doing and that he was fired for it. What was particularly interesting about this time though was that Irving confronted Burt, who was watching him from afar, where Burt revealed that he'd been watching Irving since he went to his house in the season 1 finale. During this conversation, we actually found out that Burt was pretty much forced into retirement and Lumen got rid of him because of an entanglement with a colleague. It wasn't said which colleague, but Burt put 1 and 2 together and realized that it was probably the person that was screaming his name at his front door. This shows us that Burt didn't actually choose to retire. He was forced out by Lumen because of his involvement with Irving. There's actually a lot of importance placed around the team in refinement, and Burt's association with Irving was something that Lumen clearly didn't want to have to manage, so they thought it would be easier to just get rid of him. With both Irving and Burt now being connected on the outside, and Irving attending a dinner with Burt and his husband, I wonder if we'll now start to understand what Irving is specifically doing on the outside, and why it is that he knows about the exports hallway and what he wanted his Innie to know about too. During Irving's funeral, Dylan actually found the image that Irving drew of the hallway to exports, and on the back there were directions that were from O&D. With Felicia having been to exports before, she would have definitely known the directions, so I'm imagining it was her that wrote those directions down. If Dylan ends up following them and ends up getting caught, those specific privileges that he's grown accustomed to might end up getting rescinded. With the more tougher approach that Milchick's going to be taking, I think that could be the case. The ending scene. During this episode, Mark was acting so strangely, to the point where I didn't know if it was the Outie version of Mark that was on the severed floor, or if it was just his Innie traumatized after what happened in the previous episode. In the early scenes of this episode, where Mark was in his apartment, he mentioned that he hadn't remembered anything from his Innie's point of view, and Reg Hubby responded by saying, maybe your Innie has. This could be a reason as to why Mark was acting so strange, because he might have been experiencing different things coming to him due to being reintegrated, but we might not have been seeing them. Moments such as him looking at the watermelon in a confused way, and also when he said how he wanted Irving's funeral to be quick so he could get back to work. It just all felt off and unlike him. I also think some of this could be due to the fact that he doesn't know who to trust anymore. For example, we saw that he was frustrated with Helly because everything that he thought he was telling her was now reported to Gemma and the high-ups at Lumen. So he was probably a bit deflated because the plan that he'd been working on was now known by all. We also saw that the photo on his desk was glitching, like what happened with Gemma and Helena's face when they were in the tent together. So I think there could have been more happening to Mark than what we actually ended up witnessing. It was at the end of the episode where the Outie version of Mark heard Miss Casey's voice, and we saw that he started to experience a different perspective on things. His reality was glitching, and he heard Miss Casey saying mundane generic phrases such as, your Outie pays all of his gas and electric bills within 3 business days, and your Outie listens to music while shaving, but not while showering. This was from an earlier episode in Season 1 where Innie searched for some kind of understanding as to what their Outie's life is like on the outside. With Mark seeing the severed floor and then also turning around and seeing Miss Casey, who he knows as Gemma, this was actually a really heartbreaking moment. He went from holding the box of what he thought was her ashes to being face to face with her in the space of a few minutes. And the tear in his eyes definitely reflected that hopelessness, emptiness, shock, and burning love that he had inside of him, as if he'd just seen a ghost. The episode then cut to black and left us in complete silence. It gave us a true Black Mirror moment where we were just staring at ourselves on the screen because they deliberately waited a few seconds before the credits started rolling, leaving us with the pondering thought of what was at the end of Miss Casey's sentence, and also having us hold the same expression as to what Mark had. It looks like Mark's reintegration process has become successful. I suppose the only side effects that he's had at the moment is the glitching realities and also this cough that he had throughout the entire episode. My review of the episode. I thought this was a really good installment of the show. As I said at the start, the overall mood and feeling of this episode was just horrible, but in a good way. I was so uncomfortable when watching the episode because the mood was just miserable and deflating. Honestly, Mr. Milchik being in his performance review made me laugh out loud on several occasions, especially when Mr. Drummond handed him the lunch menu. I thought the final scene in this episode with Mark laying his eyes on his wife was one of the most emotional moments in the entirety of the series. I feel like it really captured that feeling of somebody having mourned someone for so long and then the total emotion that would have paralyzed their body by seeing them again. It was beautiful, but also heartbreaking. I'd also say that the opening scene was just as haunting as what the final scene was. The mysterious nature of it and the eerie whistling provided intrigue, but also fear. This was an episode where I feel like all of the characters got a fair chunk of screen time, so it was nice to not only see the group together, but they were also thriving in their own right too with their individual stories. I don't know about anyone else, but I feel like this episode just looked so much nicer than usual. So many of the shots looked so well constructed, and the angles on many of them were just nice on the eye. It scratched an itch that I didn't even know needed scratching. For me, Severance is the most thought-provoking and the best show that's on TV right now, and I imagine it will continue to go that way for the remaining episodes that it's got. We've reached the halfway point, and I think the pacing has been spot on and the level of information that's been shared has been great too. I just hope it continues on in the way that we've been given it so far, which is perfect. If you want to see more videos on Severance Season 2, then click on the card in the top corner. There's a playlist there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a video. What did you think of episode 5? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. As always, thanks for tuning into the video and I'll see you in the next one.